Reconstruction has already begun in Syria. So we're not talking about a process that we're imagining will begin at some point in the future. It's happening through mechanisms, through programs that have been put in place by the government of Syria, by the Assad regime. Those programs are being largely funded internally. They're happening on a fairly small scale. We have all kinds of indicators that they're not effectively responding to the needs that exist in terms of reconstruction, simply because those needs are so vast. But it is important politically to recognize that reconstruction is underway. It's important in large part because it reinforces this sense that the Assad regime is defining the terms on which reconstruction will take place, and that it is launching into these processes in part to demonstrate that they are in control of how reconstruction will take place, and that anyone who might want to engage in reconstruction has to do so on the regime's terms. In terms of who's financing reconstruction, very little money is coming from outside to support reconstruction. There has been a bit of assistance from governments that have linked reconstruction to business opportunities, including some of this work in just clearing away the ruins of war. But for the most part, we have not seen a lot of help for reconstruction from external actors. So anything that's happening really is happening as a result of resources generated from within. The public sector in Syria, I think we can imagine, will play some role in reconstruction, just to the extent that some of the basic industries involved in production of construction materials are public sector firms. So there will be something of a role for the Syrian public sector. In order to talk about the private sector and public-private partnerships, we have to understand sort of the political economy of Syria a little bit. This is a political economy in which the distinction between public and private sector is very porous, in which we have a number of large state business coalitions or regime business coalitions that rest on close personal ties between very powerful figures in the regime and their counterparts in the so-called private sector. And there's no question that those business networks, that those elite business networks that bring together actors from the regime and actors from the private sector will play the principal role in reconstruction in Syria. And we've already seen it. We've seen the formation of large numbers of new, for example, real estate development companies with participants that include both key figures from the regime and their counterparts in the so-called private sector as the principals of these development companies. And they're doing everything they can to secure ownership of property that's been identified as available for redevelopment, for dominating certain sectors of the redevelopment business, and for expanding their work in areas that have experienced damage during the war so that they can benefit as those sectors again become more active. So yes, there will be a role for the private sector, but we have to be very careful about what we mean by that. And we have to recognize that the private sector will only be engaged through these very tight connections to key regime figures. Well, I think a program of inclusive reconstruction in Syria would need to rest on a set of principles, on a legal architecture, on political and legal commitments from the Assad regime that doesn't exist, and which I don't think the Assad regime is committed to putting in place. We need to see, for example, very robust legal protections for the property rights of Syrians who were forced to flee their homes as a result of conflict. We would need to see a recognition that whether or not someone whose property was destroyed or who experienced other form of loss as a result of the conflict might have resided in an area that the regime viewed as sympathetic to the opposition, that those Syrians also deserved legal protections and access to institutions governed by rule of law in order to ensure that they could recover their property in a timely and secure way. We would need to see that an environment existed in Syria that provided for IDPs and refugees to return without being exposed to potential retribution from the regime, without being exposed to forced conscription, without being exposed to other threats or challenges from those who view the return of refugees as either threatening their economic interests or as threatening politically in one way or another. Right now, we have a regime that is determined to control and exploit Reconstruction for economic and political reasons. And that is not a context in which you're likely to have much luck in instituting an inclusive Reconstruction process.